Hi, this is Mr. Mack, and we are starting in Chapter 1 of our chemistry course with an introduction to chemistry. We're going to start very general, and then we'll get a little more specific. First of all, what is science? Most people think of science as a whole bunch of stuff that we need to know, but we're going to be more technical. We're going to call it a body of knowledge. And so students think, oh, in order to be good at science, I'm going to need to memorize a lot of information. But science is so much more than that. So the first part of our definition is that scientists definitely gather information. But what's more important about science is that it is a method of understanding the world. And this speaks to something that is called worldview. And scientists typically take a very materialistic view of the world. Everything is made of stuff, and that stuff is what makes up our world. And so in order for us to understand our world, we need to understand how that matter works and interacts with each other part. And so chemistry is really all about the matter and how it interacts in the world. But we're going to see a little later on that our understanding of the world simply from a materialistic view can come into conflict with a Christian worldview as well. So, why should we study chemistry? Most of all because almost everything that happens in the world involves chemistry. And if you think a thought, there are some electrical impulses that go on in your brain that are involved in making your thought processes work. If you are going to read the paper or read a book on your iPad, all of that is involving chemistry. In order for your muscles to move, in order for you to hold the device, first of all, you're going to need to have some energy, and that comes through chemistry that happens within your body. Of course, for the device to turn on, there must be some type of a battery power, and batteries are based upon chemistry. So even if you're sleeping, those automatic processes of your heart beating, your lungs moving, are going to involve chemistry. You might find that chemistry is not involved if you're talking simply about the theory behind, say, economics, or the theory behind communism. All of these things are thoughts that you can dissociate from a person and say, oh, they don't involve chemistry. But almost everything in the whole world involves chemistry. So, what is chemistry? Chemistry is a study of the nature of matter and also the changes that matter undergoes. So when we think about chemistry, we want to understand what it is made of and then how it can chemically react with something else. That is the changes it undergoes. So chemistry can be awful fun. If you look at something and it changes colors, there's a reason behind why it changed colors. Chemistry is often called the central science because all sciences in some way involve chemistry. So chemistry is called the central science by big-headed chemists, but in actuality all the other scientists do involve some knowledge of chemistry in order to fully work with them. So the way in which scientists typically approach the world is they come up with something via the scientific method. And you may have heard a large number of steps that are involved in the scientific method. I am going to shorten it down to 3 basic steps. First of all, the scientific involves something called observations. Observations may involve a measurement, but simply it is things that you notice. And it can be as simple as, hey, the light didn't turn on when I flipped the switch. And as a result of noticing that, you might ask yourself a question. You might say that, I wonder if it's because the light bulb is burned out. So that would be leading to a hypothesis. And that hypothesis may be something along the lines of, oh, the light is turned on, but the light bulb does not light. Therefore, if I change the light bulb, the light will turn on. So a hypothesis is an explanation, but you don't know whether it's right or not. So we have to say that it is a possible explanation. And I misspelled explanation there, sorry. It is a possible explanation for an observation. It basically answers the question why something may or may not be what it is. And finally, part 3 of our scientific method is we're going to perform an experiment. Now, an experiment is going to test whether or not your hypothesis is true. So in our simple example of the light bulb in the room, if I change the light bulb and see whether or not the light turns on, I will be able to answer the question of, if I change the light bulb, the light will come on. If the light comes on, the light bulb was probably burned out. And you're able to see once again. You could say your experiment proved your hypothesis to be true. And if changing the light bulb did not work, then you would have to come up with a new hypothesis and test it. So that's very simply the scientific method in a very basic way, but adequate for our purposes. The scientific method does leave out any external forces at work in a system. So when I said that science is typically looking at matter and does not necessarily involve outside intervention, then things like miracles don't happen according to science. They don't allow for them because they say we operate in a closed system. This can be an issue for someone who believes in God, because God does enter into and work in our world today. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave that for just a little bit, but we will come back to it at the end of our lesson. Let me say another couple of things about observations. First of all, observations can be of two types. There are qualitative observations, and qualitative observations are what would appear to your senses, and they would be, the wall that I'm looking at is blue. The door is made of wood. These are qualitative observations. The other type of observation is called a quantitative. Quantitative has the word quantity in it. And so when we think of a quantitative measurement, we know that it's going to involve a number. But a number is not enough. So in addition to a number, we want to also include a unit. So if I came in and I said, hey, I have a dozen, you would be excited thinking that, oh, he brought us a dozen donuts, but I never gave you the unit. Instead, I have a dozen quizzes for you to take today. You'd be horrified. So the unit is very important. And as we go through, you're always going to assign a unit to a number. Science doesn't like unitless numbers. They don't mean anything to us. So let's take a closer look at the some other aspects of the scientific method. We're going to make an observation. So the observation is that I have more squirrels in my yard than my neighbor does. All right. Now, noticing that there's more squirrels in my yard, someone might ask the question, well, why do you have more squirrels in your yard than in your neighbor's yard. And so we'll try and answer that question by coming up with a hypothesis. So my hypothesis is something that I know to be true or false. I'm not sure which I'm going to choose yet, but I will say that my hypothesis is because we have a dog. Now, if I have a dog, you might, through your experience, say, wait a second, dogs and squirrels don't get along. Dogs chase squirrels. I don't think squirrels would want to be in your yard if you have a dog. So I would say, well, what kind of an experiment would you perform in order to prove that the reason that I have more squirrels in my yard is not because of my dog? So you may propose that I run a little test and I capture a squirrel and I put the dog and the squirrel in a cage together and see if they get along well. Good luck trying to do that experiment. And we're going to find out eventually that the reason I actually have I have more squirrels in my yard is because we have a tree that is loaded with acorns. That would be called an oak tree. All right, so I would have to perform more experiments in order to come to that conclusion. So you may need to perform another experiment once your first one proves incorrect. Okay, so let's move on then. And we're going to look at a couple of other terms that are typically associated with the scientific method. And once somebody has worked on an experiment that was trying to prove a hypothesis correct or incorrect, they'll oftentimes try to build a bigger understanding of something. And so we come up with the words theory in order to explain. And so let me tell you what a theory is. A theory is a proven set of hypotheses. So hypothesis is singular, hypotheses is going to be plural. And what a theory does is it explains why a given set of observations are true. And when we think about theories, there's a number of theories that most people have probably heard of. The theory of evolution. There is the atomic theory, and the atomic theory is typically drawn, here's the nucleus of an atom, and then there are little rings, sometimes called shells, that are arranged around that atom, kind of in a target fashion. So this is the place where there are electrons, and this is a theory that many people know that deals with chemistry. A theory tells us something about what we know to be true, and they come up with what is known as a model. So the picture that I've drawn there is a model that represents atomic theory. It tells us something about the atom that we know to be true. And the model is not necessarily accurate, and when we're together we'll talk about how that works. Next of all, let's talk about a law. A law is generally observed behavior. A law and a theory are two different things. Okay, so first of all, we're going to say that a theory explains why. A law simply tells me what happens. It does not answer the question why. That's not its purpose. So we have various laws that you have heard of as well. The law of gravity. We have the law of conservation of mass, the law of conservation of energy, and all these are laws that we say we have seen in every situation that mass is conserved. In other words, you cannot create or destroy matter. We have seen with energy that energy can transform from one form to another, but it is never created or destroyed. So these laws are what we have generally observed. They are not theories. They are not explanations of why that happens. It just tells us this is what happens. So how do we distinguish between a theory and a hypothesis, between a theory and a law, or a hypothesis and a law? So I'm going to sum up quickly by saying a theory and a hypothesis explain why. However, a law only tells us what happens. Okay? What's the difference between a theory and a hypothesis then? A theory is an overall explanation that involves proven hypotheses. And these are experimentally proven hypotheses. And a hypothesis is a little more simplistic. It is an explanation, but it's not an overall explanation. It's just an explanation of a, and I'm going to put in quotes, a single observation. It's not trying to develop a whole view of things. It's just trying to give you a quick look at something simple. So what's the difference between a theory and an observation? A theory explains why, and theories do change over time. In fact, that model of the atom that I showed you above has been superseded by a theory that proved some aspects of that model incorrect. So a theory explains why. An observation will never change, because an observation is what has been observed via your senses. So observations don't change, but theories do. And then finally, what is the difference between theories and natural laws, or what we just call laws? The theory, once again, explains why. The law tells us what happens consistently. And that is going to be the sum of what we want to do in regards to the scientific method, as well as some of the associated words that go with it. Okay, so I want you to, in preparation for class, to evaluate the following statement. Once a theory has been around for a while, and people generally believe it to be true, it becomes a law of science. And so that law of science we have as the result of a theory. Is that going to be true or false? And explain that to me a little bit, and we'll talk about it in class. Finally, think about natural laws. Things like the law of gravity, the law of conservation of mass, as well as others. And tell me, how are natural laws different from God's law? So come to class with some thoughts about that. I look forward to talking with you. Thanks.